Well, thank you very much for your very generous introduction, Professor Wang Ban. I'm greatly honored and pleased to have this rare opportunity to come here to share some of my ideas with such a distinguished audience in such an elegant place. I'm really moved that my teacher friend, David Nivison, just turned 90 and showed up to give me more instruction on his just incredible reflection on the Confucian learning of the heart and mind. I need to put this talk in the context. As announced, there will be 3 presentations. This one on Confucian humanism as spiritual exercise, and then the next one, probably on the 16th, Confucian humanism as scholarly inquiry, and then on the 21st, Confucian humanism as global governance. But that talk will be joined by Professor Francis Fukuyama. In fact, for the last 10 or 15 years, he's been very deeply involved in the study of Confucianism. He's now writing a book on China. You know, his major book just came out last year. And also, it's very gratifying to me, and also maybe a welcome to you, that Professor Robert Bella will join me for a presentation on civil society, civil religion, and global civil society on the 23rd. And as you know, Robert Bella's recent book, published by the Harvard University Press, Religion in Human Evolution, has received incredible acclaim. Habermas and Hans Jonas both praised the book, and Habermas considered that as perhaps one of the most important contributions since Max Weber. So it's 600 or 800 page long, but it's really worth reading. This reminds me, I think in 1971 to 81, when I was at UC Berkeley, I taught there for 10 years. So I was a frequent visitor to Stanford, and I ran a regular seminar on Confucian humanism, sponsored by the American Council of Learned Society. Every month, we gathered in Berkeley, Friday afternoon. After the presentation, people were invited to my home just across the street for further conversation. But the most fascinating thing for me was the next day, Saturday morning, at the faculty club, that 15 of us would sit and read carefully a text that was prepared in classical Chinese, in Confucian classic Chinese, prepared by the speaker. And David Nivison and Li Yili were always there. And the reading to me was one of the most memorable educational experiences. And I remember there was a debate between Tom Metzger and Nathan Sivan over the email for a long time. It began with a very high intellectual level, but then it degenerated. So we decided to stop that. Confucianism is very widely characterized as a form of social ethics. But since the publication of my own essay, maybe the first one in English, entitled The Creative Tension Between Ren, which is rendered as humanity, and Li, one way of rendering it now by John Bertrand is civility. Of course, we do it as ritual propriety, and so forth. That was published in 1968. I've been arguing that if we fail to recognize the, quote, religious or spiritual dimension of Confucian humanism, our interpretation will be at best one-sided. In 1976, I wrote a monograph on centrality and commonality to demonstrate through textual analysis the vital importance of, quote, religiousness. Some people use religiosity in Confucian self-understanding. Of course, I was critically aware that, as Wilford Kenworth Smith, in his book on the religion, the end of religion, races and observed, whether or not Confucianism is a religion is a question that the Chinese scholars have never raised. And the Western sinologies have yet to provide a satisfactory answer. My interpretive position has been repeatedly, of course, challenged by especially colleagues in Culture China, and I would say often misunderstood. Some of my critics are worried that I may have undermined Confucian rationalism by introducing some kind of unexamined, mysterious element into the Confucian discourse. Of course, the less charitable ones accuse me of misunderstanding Confucian this-worldliness or this worldly value orientation, and even a deliberate attempt to westernize, specifically to Christianize Confucian humanism. In fact, this was really mentioned by Fritz Mote in the preface to a book that I asked him to write a critical preface. So he praised me, but then worried that I may have inadvertently used Christian ideas to introduce Confucianism. Of course, I admit that I am a beneficiary of Christian theology, even though I'm not a Christian, and so I learned a great deal. But the argument, of course, has to be rooted in the Confucian tradition, not just in the classical, but also in the Neo-Confucian. So the purpose of this introductory note is to provide a context for the term spiritual exercise in the title of the lecture. I'm sympathetic to the view that Confucianism is considered as a form of social ethics. But I strongly object to the characterization of Confucian ethics as, quote, secular. Since the publication of, many of you know, Herbert Fingerad's thought-provoking essay on Confucius, the Secular as Sacred, in 1974, I believe, most ethicists have refrained from using the adjective secular to depict Confucian ethics. The preferred term now, especially by what I call the Stanford School or the Nevinsonian School, is virtue ethics. Yet, once the Aristotelian concept is introduced into the Confucian discourse, the religious category becomes highly problematical. And of course, an extreme form that is Roger Ames. He will consider any way of looking at Confucian ethics religiously is a distortion. The distinction between philosophy and religion is firmly established in modern academy, especially in the Anglo-American academy. Those who are committed to the professional requirements of reasoning based on logic, analysis, insight, and taste are apprehensive by their colleagues' mode of scholarship in religious studies. From their point of view, the philosophical point of view, the religionists put too much emphasis on existential commitment and experiential understanding. Maybe I should begin a note on my own method. I take it for granted that logic and analysis are necessary and essential for all philosophical inquiries. Indeed, they are basic to virtually all academic pursuits: literature, history, anthropology, sociology, not to mention economics. So religious studies in this sense will have to be based upon logic and analysis. So this is also true with religious studies. But in general, an added feature is required for religious studies. And let's bracket that. I will simply make use of a term personal or personal engagement. Of course, Michael Polanyi's notion, the very seminal idea of personal knowledge, readily comes to mind, but it is too complicated for us to get into this. A fundamental distinction for me between personal and private is important. In John Stuart Mill's defense of privacy, the liberal traditions are very deeply involved with this. The things that I consider private are by definition confidential. Now, I don't want that to be open to the public, and even I try to hide it from close relatives and even intimate friends. Of course, hopefully they're also protected by customs and laws. So the whole question about privacy as a right has become a major issue in China for the last few years. On the other hand, what I consider to be personal may not be private at all. Indeed, precisely because I personally feel strongly about something, either a public issue, a considered opinion, or a cherished idea, I'm willing and in a way compare by an inner desire to express, discuss, and share it. In this connection, I will regard my personal view to be transparent, public, debatable, and of course, falsifiable. It is not merely my private idea, actually a claim that is not subjective or even idiosyncratic. Implicit in this idea of the personal is the existential commitment and experiential understanding are not in conflict, necessarily in conflict with logicality or analyticity. Margaret Mead's, the anthropologist, distinction between digital and anthropological thinking is pertinent here. If we opt for the anthropological way, we must try to transcend the allure of or the seduction of clarity and accept ambiguity as way of learning and even way of life. Ambiguity in this sense is often the result of a wise decision not to tie up loose ends prematurely. We may even say that it is a demonstration of the courage to explore further and probe deeper, not too much obsessed with clarity. The ambiguity is an inevitable outcome of intellectual sophistication. Far from being a state of confusion, the ambiguity, as Benjamin Schwartz talked about, is fruitful. Fruitful ambiguity. It's also promising. Pierre Hadot's inspiring book, published originally in French but available in English, Philosophy as a Way of Life, is an illustration of this mode of thinking. The subtitle of this book, quote, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Michel Foucault, addresses the question that I intend to explore. In fact, I was introduced to this book by Hilary Putnam, as you know, the major mathematical logician. And he said after he read that book, he realized that doing philosophy is meaningful and significant. In the Confucian perception, spiritual exercise refers to moral practice as the necessary and authentic way of learning to be human. The centrality of self-cultivation, 修身, in the Confucian tradition cannot be overstated. In the opening text of the Great Learning, it is clearly asserted that from the emperor to the commoner, all, without exception, must take self-cultivation as the rule. 自天子以至于庶人，一事皆以修身为本. The Confucian vision of self-cultivation as embodied in the Great Learning extends from the self to family, state, and the world, 天下. The common reading of the cultivation of the self, regulation of the family, governance of the state, and peace of all under heaven as a linear sequential development is basically very misleading. You first cultivate yourself, then you're allowed to use that to regulate your family. If you regulate your family, then you will be able to govern the state and so forth. It is totally misunderstanding. I think that's one of the reasons why Tom Metzger earlier talked about the Confucian predicament. The predicament is the Confucians' failure to extend their self-cultivation beyond. But this is an intrinsic value. This is not a utilitarian idea whether self-cultivation would be useful for family regulation or peace under heaven. It is something you have to do as a human being. Otherwise, you're not being human. Surely, self-cultivation is a rule as a point of departure. But in moral practice, it is essential that self-cultivation continues its presence in family regulation, state governance, and world peace. Actually, self-cultivation increases its complexity and relevance as social involvement and responsibility extend outward. Just one example Many people believe that the Confucians romanticize the loving relationships within the family. That's certainly not true. Confucians were critically aware of the complexity of the family. It's a complex system. You know, in the Book of Measures, talking about the father of Sun, who was a very brutish guy, and Sun came from the most abusive family you can imagine. And he not only survived, he managed to harmonize the relationship. That's why it was considered sage. Most of us are not able to do that. So when we get into the situation of the family, we realize even in China with 3 or 5 people, it's a very complex system because gender, age, status, power, authority, all these enter into the picture. Anyone in the family, not to mention an abusive father or an irresponsible mother, or a son, either a son or daughter, doesn't want to collaborate, the family becomes dysfunctional. So that's the question about cultivation. I think in the Tang Dynasty, a Zhang family happened to have 9 generations under the same roof. The emperor becomes so impressed, he invited the old man, who's even older than David, to the court, and he decided only to write one character to demonstrate his secret. The word, as you all know, is ren, which means tolerance. So it is a form of cultivation or tolerance, endurance that everybody will have to be involved. If we envision this complexity as a series of concentric circles, then the outer realm becomes more difficult and demanding. In other words, the intensity of self-cultivation is proportionate to the degree of social engagement. So the older we are, the more complicated it becomes. By implication, there's also a vertical dimension. Authorities, vertical dimension, those who are wealthier, stronger, more powerful, more authoritative, and have more accesses to non-material resources, ought to feel more obligated to promote the well-being of the entire society. So the burden of self-cultivation upon them is heavier. The preoccupation of the Confucian scholar officials with the self-cultivation of the emperor is dictated by a fear that the dire consequences of corruption at top, as well as the hope that exemplary personality at the highest level would definitely spread goodwill throughout the country. This is commonsensical. And therefore, I argue against Tang Yijie's interpretation that self-cultivation is elitist. In other words, only those of us have means. We spend a weekend going through massage parlors, sink in good water, and sip nice fluid, can do self-cultivation. Most of other people, especially the worker, who has to survive by working hard, when he becomes very tired, the most he can do is to watch TV, drinking beer, sometimes hit his wife. How can he be involved in self-cultivation? Well, if he learn not to hit his wife, if he learn to drink beer not too much, if he learn to cut down his TV exposure, that's self-cultivation. No one can escape that. Even someone who's in jail or someone is totally isolated in that sense. So to consider it as elitist is certainly un-Confucian. Self-cultivation as spiritual exercise is present in indigenous religions as well as axial age civilizations. Judaic rabbi, Christian ministers, Muslim mullahs, Buddhist monks, Hindu gurus, Shinto priests, or Hawaiian kahunas, and Navajo elders are by definition exemplars of self-cultivation. We respect them because their sense of themselves based upon their spiritual cultivation is a source of inspiration for us. Hardo, Pierre Hardo, I just mentioned, and Martha Nussbaum's works on Greek philosophy clearly established the claim that philosophy, in the core of its quest for self-knowledge, is concerned about human flourishing. I will argue that a defining characteristic of human flourishing is spiritual or mental self-transformation. This is not only true with the Stoics, that's Pierre Hadot's focus. The Platonists and the Aristotelians are deeply immersed in this kind of exercise as well. This is certainly the case with all major medieval theologians, such as St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, or the Jewish thinker Maimonides, and virtually all Islamic philosophers. And in this connection, I'm reminded of the fact that Thomas Aquinas was the great theologian, very Aristotelian, very much involved in analytical inquiry, because the Summa Theologica is considered the most well-argued theological text. To the end of his life, when he experienced something he called a real personal encounter with God, he said, all my theological works pale by comparison with this intense personal sense of bliss. If we follow this line of thinking, I would say Kant, Immanuel Kant, as well as Kierkegaard, Hegel, as well as Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, as well as Heidegger, and Dewey, as well as Paul Tillich, are all profoundly involved in their distinctive, different, very different, contemplative mode of life can be a spiritual exercise as well. Karl Marx is attributed with the statement that religion is the opium of the people. In this connection, he was possibly influenced by Auguste Comte's idea that in the age of science, metaphysics is illusory and the religion is insubstantial. But as Robert Ballard recently pointed out, if you put the Marxist remark in the proper context, his perception of religion is certainly not perfunctory, because in that remark he said all major criticisms came from criticisms of religion. And then religion is, I'm paraphrasing, is the cry of the people who have no recourse to any help. Religion is the heart in a heartless society. Then religion is the opium of the people. So in that context, Marx, as deeply immersed in Judaism, was of course very seasoned, very musical, sensitive to religious matters. So I will argue, in this case, it may not be far-fetched to say that the so-called Western thinkers, like Confucius, Taoists, Buddhists, are also, I use the term, right now it's rather awkward. I often use the term that religio philosophers, in other words, philosophers that are very sensitive to the quest, to what Tillich would call the ultimate meaning of life, or the ultimate concern. Of course, there are philosophers who refuse to define themselves in religious and spiritual terms. They're still very much the mainstream. They make a clear distinction between their disinterested, value-neutral, analytical, and objective approach to scholarship from those who are obsessed with subjective and often faith-based modes of thinking. I'm not in a position to judge the unintended negative consequences of the so-called epistemological and linguistic terms in modern age. There's no question that these two terms define the whole philosophical enterprise for the last century or more. But this development, in a way, can be criticized because it totally collapses the difference between analytical technique, a sort of a basic training in any rational discourse, with a genuine philosophizing, and with genuine philosophizing, meaning to philosophize, to do philosophy, rather than to think about philosophy, involves a personal commitment in a way comparable to not necessarily faith, the intensity to the spiritual transformation of the self. Of course, this particular mode of thinking, analysis for its own sake, has been severely criticized, or even, I think, thoroughly criticized by some of the most brilliant practitioners of the analytical school in the American Academy. Of course, the most notable example is Richard Rorty, here. All right. And maybe just a personal note, my own encounter with philosophy as taught at Harvard University in the 1960s may serve as a reference. My original intention was to further develop my schooling in Chinese philosophy with particular emphasis on the Confucian learning of the heart, so-called 心学, by encountering some of the most brilliant minds in the West, in America at the time. And I, of course, focused my attention on the three areas: aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy of religion. To my surprise, the faculty at the time, the Harvard faculty, having engrossed in logic, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and ontology, were inattentive to these subjects. I was tolerant to their inattention, but I was really annoyed by their arrogance in undermining the philosophical inquiries that to me are relevant to and essential for human understanding. So I studied ethics with Charles L. Stevenson, who was a visitor from Michigan. I studied German philosophy with Dietrich Henrich from Heidelberg. But as you know, in the 80s, all Harvard professors, John Rawls, Nozick, and Stanley Cavell, all became immersed in ethics, aesthetics. And even Hilary Putnam became interested in philosophy of religion. What happened in the last 30 or so years has, from my point of view, very encouraging. With a view toward the future, I sense, I use the term cautiously, but also with some nervousness, a kind of spiritual turn in professional philosophical circles. This is in the offering. I have only very anecdotal references, but they are revealing. Of course, Alex McIntyre's work on Aristotle, After Virtue, is a clear indication we need to go back to the source of Western learning. Of course, Whitehead has made the remark that all Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. But in McIntyre's work, he's also very deeply involved in Catholicism. As you know, that dimension has to be understood. Toward the end of Derrida's life, as you know, he continued to offer the seminar on pardon, which is the Jewish category of pardon. And he became deeply immersed in his own Jewish tradition. In a dialogue on postmodernism between Richard Rorty and Gianni Vattimo, I had the privilege of moderating it at the East-West Philosophers Conference in the early 21st century. And Richard Rorty, as you know, he's totally uninterested in religion. And he believes philosophy eventually will be a kind of hybridity, all kinds of mixing of things, and maybe only one language that will matter, that's English. After he visited China, he's probably with two. But anyway, very limited languages required. But Gianni Vattimo, this Italian philosopher, made it very, very clear that he said, I'm returning to Catholicism as a postmodernist. But of course, he made it very clear his Catholicism is very different or radically different from the Catholicism as preached by the Vatican. Now, Hilary Putnam, I mentioned him before, gave a course on 4 Jewish thinkers, Maimonides, Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, and Levinas, before he retired. And of course, Catholic religiousness is obviously a source of inspiration for Charles Taylor's recent book on the secular age. And even Habermas, who for a long time is unmusical to religious matters, for the last 10 years has been deeply involved in the study of religion. And he's writing a book on the axial age civilization, again with emphasis on religion. What is the implication of this new situation for us to understand Confucian self-cultivation as spiritual exercise? Once we transcend the exclusive dichotomy between philosophy and religion, the great divide between the Hebrew and the Greek legacies of the modern West or the modern Western thought is no longer unbridgeable. In light of the modes of thought in Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Confucianism, Judaic, Christian, and Islamic theologians are self-evidently philosophical. Similarly, the Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle is profoundly religious. However, Hardo points out that spiritual exercise in the classical Greek sense is by and large oblivious to the modern mind. For example, a kind of psychoanalytical reading of Marcus Aurelius' meditation is totally inadequate. Some psycho-philosophers said Marcus Aurelius must have suffered from ulcer, suffered from nervousness, suffered from tension-ridden psychosomatic problems, because in his meditation, this idea about I'm going to die, again occurred and occurred. But Hardo said, this is my last day. It's the spiritual exercise of all the Stoics. Everybody say, this is my last day. What should I do? This is the exercise. This is not a manifestation of their psychosomatic problems. Actually, from Hardo's point of view, Foucault's concerted effort to underscore the importance to care for the self, to the end. I even attended one of the lectures he gave on self-cultivation. And it's something not only totally different, but significantly different from what the Stoics, and for that matter, other forms of spiritual exercise the Greeks put into practice. In other words, the modern idea of spiritual exercise, not at all congenial to what the Greeks, Confucians, and so forth. I would even say that we are aware of this so-called health-related exercises. Thank you. Health-related exercises such as breathing, sitting, yoga, and gymnastics, devoid of any kind of spiritual core, hardly meet the minimum requirements of what the Greeks, Chinese, Confucians, Christian, Buddhist, and indigenous or other similar forms of practice. So this has nothing if that whole background is devoid as a form of spiritual exercises. Nevertheless, among the axial age civilizations, Confucianism is unique in its deliberate choice to focus its self-cultivation effort in this world. Its refusal to anchor this kind of cultivation either in nature or the transcendent sprang from Confucius' existential choice to resist the temptation to leave the world that has already lost its way. He understood the meaning of the proto-Taoists who urged him to join them by insisting that the world cannot be saved. So why not just join us? Confucius made a very clear remark, I cannot herd with birds and beasts. If I'm not a human being among other human beings, whom could I be associated with? 鸟兽不可与同群，无非世人之徒欲而随欲。This determination to reject alternative forms of life by committing himself to live in the world is, of course, most consequential for shaping the value orientation of the Confucian project. To him, neither a sanctuary in nature nor an imagined paradise can substitute the lived reality we encounter in our daily existence. It is vitally important to know that the choice is not to accept the world as it is, let alone submit to its status quo. That's why Weber's interpretation is basically wrong, but to transform it from within. Confucius' self-cultivation, so conceived, is fundamentally different from forms of spiritual exercises with particular reference to the transcendent. Of course, there's a variety of transcendence, either the wholly other, or radical otherness, or even the immanent transcendence. But anyway, this idea of the transcendence doesn't feature prominently in the Confucian discourse. This commitment to this world is an essential feature of the Confucian idea of self-realization. This, of course, is the realm that Immanuel Durkheim, in his facilitas expression, the profane or the secular. The sacred is the transcendent, the spiritual sanctuary, whereas the secular is our ordinary life. Either the kingdom of God yet to come or the other shore, from the Buddhist point of view, is absolutely different from the life world, that unless we transcend, either by rejecting or overcoming what is experienced and understood here and now, we'll never acquire a taste, let alone a deep appreciation of what is the highest reality, the ultimate concern. Of course, we should qualify it because the Buddhists would not consider ultimate reality as real. But even the idea of emptiness is clearly radically different from the experience here and now. And yet, from the Confucian point of view, that the secular as sacred, strictly speaking, is not an appropriate understanding, because this mode of thinking is quite alien to Confucian humanism. The exclusive dichotomies that have become our basic conceptual apparatuses, such as matter-spirit, body-mind, flesh, soul, mental-physical, idealist, materialist, creator-creature, and the secular sacred, are considered somewhat irrelevant to self-cultivation philosophy. In the great learning, dichotomies are not exclusive, but complementary. There's a tension and conflict between each of them, but the methodological choice is not either or, but both and. The relationship between root and branch, but more. Formal and latter, 先后. Above and below, left, right, shallow, deep, beginning, end, and part, whole, is in Andrew Plack's characterization bipolar complementarities. The potential for harmony is always there because the relationship, I would say, is dialogical rather than dialectic. The mutuality enriches both sides. The synthesis, so to speak, is not built on the overcoming of thesis and antithesis. Rather, it is the fruitful interaction of the two, allowing both to be open and receptive without losing their integrities. Because of the time, I need to move ahead. I want to make two further points. The first one is the cardinal virtue in the Confucian tradition is humanity, 人, even though many scholars, especially in the United States, who considered the civility as more prominent. But I don't want to go into the argument. I just assume that humanity, 人, is the most important virtue. One way of demonstrating that is to say the idea of humanity appears more than 109 times in the Analects. And the use of this idea before the Analects did not have any philosophical meaning comparable to what Confucius did in the Analects. Ren actually means good or beautiful. So it became a very prominent virtue. You have to pick two most important virtues in the Confucian tradition. Normally, like in Mencius, is 仁 and 义, humanity and rightness. And then in the Zhongyong, there's the 三达德, the three cardinal virtues. That's 智仁勇, that's wisdom, humanity, and courage. Then you have the Mencius four beginnings, 仁义礼智. So humanity, rightness, civility, and wisdom. And then you have the 五常, adding trust. So whether you call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, humanity is always there. So this is one demonstration that the prominence of this idea. So you can say that humanity is both a comprehensive virtue. In a sense, no other virtues can afford not to have an element of ren as an integral part of it. If rightness or righteousness, yi, without ren, then yi becomes harsh, becomes overcritical. Li, civility without ren becomes formalistic. Courage without ren becomes some kind of bravery, which may not be very moral or civilized. And trust without ren is a small trust, 小信. Wisdom without ren becomes just being smart. So ren is everywhere. At the same time, all these virtues, civility, courage, and so forth, enrich the fruitfulness of the idea of ren. So it is possible to imagine someone who's li, but not ren. It is not possible to imagine someone is ren, but not li. If you are ren, then you are li. You are yong. You are not only civil, you are courageous, you are righteous. So I think, and yet the important thing in terms of self-cultivation philosophy is that the ren is internal. This is the Mention line. Even in the Xunjian line, you can argue some kind of internality, but I leave that question aside. In the Mention line of the learning of the heart and mind, ren is internal. If we use the modern concept, it is sympathy, empathy, and compassion. These are internal qualities of being human. This quality is not learned. It is not possible to imagine a person who is not, in principle, sympathetic. And of course, now there are a lot of studies of this. Some people now realize that during Kagan, a number of years argued that at the age of 2. Right now, some people say at the age of 1. Some people say even in a few months. In other words, the ability of a human, a baby, to respond sympathetically to the outside world is very basic. Rationality has to be learned. And it takes a long, long time to learn, but ren is not. So what does this mean? This means there must be something we call subjectivity of a person. I know the word subjectivity has been so deconstructed that anyone uses the word subjectivity, from the postmodernist point of view or the cultural studies will consider this outmoded. But I use this to say the autonomy, independence, and dignity of the person is based upon the person's embodiment of ren. Of course, you say human rights as one way of doing it, but ren, what is ren then? Now, we have a problem. I did have a problem when I wrote that article in 1968 about the creative tension between ren and li. I assumed at the time that ren refers to inner morality, and these the outer manifestations of inner morality. I thought it worked out quite neatly. But etymologically, we have a major problem because the word ren is written with 2, right? 像人偶 with 2. And Peter Buchberg, really the great sinologist, perhaps the best ever. And he decided to write an article in very few articles he ever published in Philosophy East and West. It's called, he rendered ren as co-humanity. There's no way a Chinese would think about ren as a person. It's always 2 persons. That worried me a lot if I insist upon subjectivity, right? Well, many of you may know in 1993, the Guodian material became unearthed, 30,000 characters. And basically, most people consider that between Confucius and Mencius. Some people like Li Xueqin insist that's the recovery of the so-called 思梦学派, especially 子思子. You know how the character ren is written there? It's just amazing. On top is the body, 身, and below is the 心. The body and 心, 身 and 心. You cannot, no matter stretch your imagination to say 身和心 is social. 身和心 is your body and mind. And now we realize in the 说文解字, when Xu Sheng decided to interpret ren as this one, he also said there's an old form, 古字, which is written as a qian on top and a xin below. Now we know for sure that qian actually is misreading of the sen of the body. Sen and xin, that's ren. Anyway, and this is a very interesting issue for us to discuss. I just offered it. I don't think my position is conclusive, but I think it's worth exploring. So the idea, the Neo-Confucian idea of Confucianism, learning for the sake of the self, learning of the body and mind, learning of nature and destiny, 身心之学, 性命之学, 位己之学, it becomes more persuasive. And I would like to conclude that with a view toward the future, virtually all major spiritual traditions in the Axis Age civilizations have to undergo a major transformation. And this is the question we are all familiar with. It's the viability of the human species, which means the care for the earth is not only a moral imperative, it's a religious commitment. So no religion in the modern times can afford to say that the earth is the world of the Caesars. Let's forget about it. We wait for the kingdom of God yet to come. The earth in itself is polluted. So what's wrong with further pollution? And the Buddhists cannot say, look, we look for the other shore, the pure land. The earth is the red dust, is the Hongchen. It's polluted. So that's the reason why the most powerful Buddhist movements are all engaged Buddhism, or 人间佛教. The Buddhists are interested in transforming the world from within. And some of the most articulate minds in the Christian theological thinking try to develop a social gospel, even reinterpret the Genesis. Human beings are not created to dominate the world. Human beings are created to serve as stewards for the world. So that's a major transformation. So all religious traditions, I just use Christianity and Buddhism as examples, will have to develop two languages. One is the language specific to that tradition. In the Christian tradition, if you don't use terms such as the Trinity, incarnation, resurrection, it's difficult for you to become a Christian. In Buddhism, if you don't talk about Dharma, Nirvana, transmigration, and these two languages are not interchangeable. You have to have dialogue, you have to have mutual respect, mutual learning, but they're different. So another language we have to develop. We know that we become humans before we become Christians and Buddhists or other traditions, or Confucians for that matter. Therefore, to be human requires the language of global citizenship. So each of the spiritual traditions will develop a language of global citizenship. Now, Confucianism has only one language. This again is a controversial point. Confucianism doesn't have two languages, precisely because Confucius chose to be in the world. And because it has only one language, which means any idea, any person, any institution in the Confucian tradition is subject to criticism. You can debate and argue anything you see fit. The Confucius, so what? He's not a founder. Sure enough, many people say he's not a founder because he's a transmitter. Confucius is not necessarily the highest manifestation of Confucian spirituality because he was not Yao and Sun. No, these are sage kings. The institution of filiality or ancestral worship is very important in China, but not in Japan, and so forth. So if you open the Confucian discourse, there's no dogma. In the sense, there are dogmas in many other traditions. So what is the implication of this? And so my work in the future is try to demonstrate, not to demonstrate, try first to understand, to appreciate what is the limitations and uniqueness of this particular mode of thinking. There are many, many limitations. Politicization is a good limitation. Later we'll have a chance to explore that. Too much immersed in the world, too much emphasis on the family, on social relationships, and of course corruptions and so forth can very well be intertwined with that. But at the same time, it has obvious strengths, and that need to be further explored. Thank you.